Fractal Design has updated their Define S2 Meshify, and behold, the Meshify 2. On paper, the differences between the Meshify S2 and the new Meshify 2 are significant. You can now pack in, for example, a load more storage inside the Meshify 2. But other tweaks that look of interest to us are things like a front panel that's no longer tethered, so you can pull it away without having cables attached. Gonna have to pull the case apart, but first we're gonna do a double peel. Oh, one. And the second is inside the glass. 2. Meshify 2. Let's see if I can pull it apart without any tools. Clear glass side panel. Looks like no tint whatsoever. Rear panel, steel, no noise deadening material at all. Thought for a second I cut myself there, but nope, no damage done. Top panel pops off. The steel mesh is held on with tabs, so that's 2 parts. That mesh obviously acting as a filter. We've had this conversation a couple of times in comments on case reviews. Clearly, if you have fans in the roof of your case, you don't require a filter of any sort if the air is flowing up. But what about when you turn your PC off? What might drop inside? Mesh on the top is a good thing rather than just open vents. But Fractal's gone one better. We've got a separate clip-in dust filter underneath. So that is really 2 filtration systems. On the top we have a rack which can support 120, 140 units of cooling, and there's also a space there for a fill port. Front panel, mesh, which after all is what gives this case its name. Hold on to the Fractal logo. It's a door. None of that horrible sticking your fingers up inside to get the front panel off, which is what you had to do with some of the early Meshify cases. Let me see. Yes. So the hinges are clip in place. There's no need to unscrew anything to remove that door. With the door in my mitts, I can pull off this inner filter. So now I'm using mesh rather than mesh plus filter. Airflow all the way. Quite a simple part. And inside we've got 2 Fractal 140 fans at the front, 1 140 Fractal fan at the rear. And if you note, the interior of the case is black, the fans are black, even though this is described as being a white case. And the main feature at the front at the top is the dust filter. Full length dust filter slides out to the front, which means even if your case is pushed back against a wall, you can still gain access to the filter, which is good. As I was saying, we've got the front I/O panel, which is fixed to the case, couple of screws there, cables go inside. And we've got headset jacks, USB Type-C, power button, reset button, pair of USB 2.0s. Actually, let's drag out the cables and just confirm that. Turn to the back. Off with that panel. My mistake, USB 3s. Okay, so they're wrongly coloured. Those ports there are USB 3s, and then that's a Type-C 3.1, which means if you've got an old school motherboard without USB 3 and USB 3.1, tough luck. But frankly, in this day and age, you want these connectors. What we do not have a hint of is anything in the way of RGB. No surprise there with Fractal. I think I teased them somewhat with a previous review, suggesting maybe it's time for them to move to RGB. They haven't. I don't have an issue with that. It is at the moment one of the very few things that separates them from a great many other case manufacturers, Corsair and Phanteks being too obvious, and indeed Thermaltake. However, there is also nothing in the way of sound deadening material. And indeed, if you pull out those extra dust filters on the top and the front, then I imagine this case has the potential to get rackety. So we've got 3 fans installed. Here we have a revised fan hub, which is PWM, and that sits up there pretty much out of sight. Previously the fan hub would sit on the rear of the motherboard tray and take up a socking great big amount of space. This case looks distinctly familiar, and the reason it looks familiar is Define 7, which certainly looks different to the Meshify 2, but let's see how it looks when we strip off the panels and look at the core chassis in isolation. And remind myself, actually it's a while since I've looked at the Define 7, so rear panel has noise deadening material, as does the upper panel. Behind the door on the front panel, we've got more noise deadening material. That filter is about 80% of the height, because we have the option of an optical drive bay. So what do you think? You may be wondering, am I saying that Fractal has simply changed the front panel of the 2 cases, and if we put the mesh front panel on the Define 7, lo and behold, it's a Meshify 2? No. The floors of the cases are riveted to the core chassis, so these metal projections, they're going nowhere. If I take the frame of the Meshify front panel and offer it up to the Define 7, it's simply not going to go on. So there's no option of putting the mesh front panel on the Define 7. And similarly, if I take the Meshify 2 and the front panel from the Define 7 and offer that up, that's having none of it either. Let's turn that sideways so you get a better view. Simply not going on. So there's been enough change to the front I/O panels and to the floor sections of the cases that even though I'm quite sure the core chassis are, I think they're identical, but they might just be very, very similar, but you can't interchange one panel from one case to the other. And because the floors are fixed in place, you don't even have the option of changing, what would it be, front and top. I'm fairly sure the sides interchange. Let me just try actually, do the sides interchange. Back panel for Meshify 2, no noise deadening material. So let's just check that clips back in place nicely. And on the Define 7, just as I'd expect. And let's see what happens with the top filter. So for the Define 7 in white, I've got a white top filter. Just demonstrate. Okay, like so. With the Meshify 2, which is nominally white but is actually black and white, I've got a black top filter. So now let's try swapping them over. There we go. I'm not suggesting you want to do that for any reason. The point is the chassis are the same. And that's good news, because I liked the Define 7 a great deal. Fractal made all sorts of changes from the previous Define. Fractal designed Define R6. Yeah, that was the model code. They made all sorts of changes, all sorts of tweaks that just brought the case into the, I was about to say 20th century, but that's rude, 21st century, 2020 is where it would be at. My list of complaints about the Define 7 was very short, but one of them was that that front door choked airflow. Clearly moving to a mesh front panel should make all the difference in the world, and that's what I'm now going to check out. But the core chassis itself, the fact Fractal's carried it over, I don't have any problem with that. I'm slightly surprised they seem to have changed more than just the front panel. I truly expected it would just be an interchangeable thing from one model to the other, you know, mesh or door, but no. It's worth mentioning the Define 7 comes with this top panel which has noise deadening material and also an alternate airflow panel. The Meshify 2 does not come with the solid panel because it's airflow all the way, so you only get the one top panel in the package. However, the price is slightly lower than the Define 7, and I would say that's down to the change in the panel. Seems fine by me. That's the broad overview of the Meshify 2. Now let's start looking at some details. The case is supplied in what Fractal calls open mode. We've seen this with earlier models, the S2 and the Fractal Define R6, to name but two. In other words, it looks conventional. So you've got your two fans at the front, your one fan at the rear, an open roof so you can easily put a liquid cooler or custom loop cooling in the roof. Plenty of space for your graphics card, which will be about here. And then for storage, we've got a couple of drive bays there. They don't have separate caddies, so you remove the sled, install the drive, slide it back in. And we have a couple of SSD mounts there. We also have this cute little multi-bracket, which I'll come to, which can be used for pretty much anything. But in this position here, you could use it for another SSD or hard drive mount. We're pretty much good to go. Or we can start moving things around. So this cover here, which is in two parts, opens up this space at the front. So if you want to install a long radiator in the front of the case, now you've got space. Oh look, the hard drive caddy's in the way. However, we've got easy access to screws in the floor. If we slacken the screws rather than remove them all the way, we can move the caddy backwards like so. Still have access to the drive space. And now we have space for a radiator in the floor of the case, full length at the front. Alternatively, we'll remove the screws. And then we can slide the caddy to the rear of the floor, out with the power supply cover, and the caddy sneaks out. I'm not quite sure why it doesn't just come out there, but never mind, not too difficult. Nonetheless, if you're doing it that way, you certainly want to do that before you start your build rather than when the power supply is in place. And now the floor of the case is completely open. And you can see we have 120, 140mm spacing there, because you can install fans or cooling in the floor, in the front, or in the roof. And now you're looking at the case pretty much as the exploded diagram from Fractal shows it. And it looks dead conventional, frankly. There's lots of space, easy access to the components. Doing your build not too difficult. There are a few other little tricks up Fractal's sleeve. We have a couple of vertical graphics slots. You can install a graphics riser here as an accessory. Fractal offered me that accessory. I said no, because at the moment it's PCI Express Gen 3. And I recently had a nasty experience with the Gen 3 riser on Gen 4 hardware, Gen 4 motherboard and Gen 4 graphics. The system wouldn't boot. So when they have a Gen 4 riser, I'll look at it, but not until then. And now if we remove the expansion slots, so effectively we have no restriction on graphics card installation whatsoever. I mentioned that the Meshify 2 is supplied in open mode, which means that this panel here is pushed to the rear. The alternative approach is to move this panel forward. That puts the case into storage mode. You can see where it's going to end up if you look at these screws here, which secure the edge of the plate. They are going to end up there. So we've got a steel frame and we've got this clipped in plastic plate, which keeps it looking all neat and tidy. If we pull that out, there we go. And now I can release this multi-bracket. It's a very simple piece of steel, can be used either for mounting a pump or a pump reservoir, or a 2.5-inch SSD or 3.5-inch hard drive. Moving the drive plate into position is not especially difficult. 1 screw on the top, 3 screws at the front. However, that screw there is a bit fiddly because you need an appropriate screwdriver that can go in here. Not ideal, not the end of the world. With this plate moved, what do? You reach for the great big Meshify 2 accessory box, which contains the guide, screws and various bits and pieces, and 4 drive plates. So we've got these 2 drive plates that came in the drive cage in the floor of the case, and we've got 4 more of the same, total of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Install a drive on the plate in exactly the same way as you would if it was going in the cage at the bottom. Hook that little tang into the plate, swing it round, lock the screw, and that's going to drive that little tab into place as well. Tad fiddly, but it does work. And there we go. We've got 6 plates included with the case, and there they are, all 6 up there. Obviously you could have 2 in the floor as I originally showed you, 4 up here, and there'd be plenty more gaps. If you want, of course, you can buy more of these plates as accessories from Fractal. You'll be looking at a monumental amount of storage. And now you've seen the Fractal exploded diagram in real life, hopefully it all makes perfect sense. And you can also see that when they show the example builds, for example water reservoir, clearly that's the case in open mode as originally shown, with drives on the back, drives in the bottom, liquid cooling at the front, and a radiator both at the front and the top. The server build example would have looked really peculiar if I hadn't shown you the case converted to storage mode, but you can see we've got hard drives mounted in the roof of the case, we've got SSDs mounted on the power supply shroud, drives in the floor of the case, and drives mounted up the storage plate in the brackets as supplied and also sold as accessories. A monumental amount of storage. When it comes to cooling, you can mount 3 120 or 140s in the front, 3 120 or 140s in the roof, 2 in the floor, 1 at the rear. And for liquid cooling, you can mount a 360 or 280 radiator in the front, a 280 or 240 rad in the floor, which seems to me a bit over the top when you consider your power supplies down there, and a 360 or 420 in the roof of the case. This is, you will understand, in open mode rather than storage mode. The options you get offered with Meshify 2 are mind-boggling. You can pack it out with storage, install a heap of cooling, go for a high-end gaming PC, pretty much anything you want with the exception of what? You can't put a dual system build inside the case, and you don't get any RGB supplied as standard. And now, finally, it's time to build a PC inside the Meshify 2. That's my PC built, and it looks reasonably tidy. Processor is an AMD Ryzen 9 3900X. Motherboard ASRock B550 Extreme 4. CPU cooler is a Fractal Design Celsius S36. That's a 360mm in the roof of the case. Memory 32GB Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 3600MHz. Graphics card is a Gigabyte RTX 2080 Super Gaming OC. And round the back we have a Seasonic Focus PX 850W Platinum power supply. And finally we've made it to the thermals for Meshify 2, and the big question, how does Meshify 2 compare to the Define 7? Throughout my testing I had all 6 fans in the case set to full speed, so that's 1000 RPM for the case fans, 1200 RPM for the 3 fans on the liquid cooler. Noise levels throughout the testing, depending on the exact configuration at that moment, all perfectly reasonable, audible but reasonable, going from 47 decibels up to 48.5 decibels at a distance of 1 meter measured at the front and the side. So noise throughout, you can certainly hear it. I'll give you a couple of examples. and that's at full speed. Slow the fans down to quiet mode here. I've got the glass off. Very quiet. And with my testing, it's a tale of two halves. If I do a straightforward run of Blender Classroom with the Ryzen 9 3900X, the Meshify 2 runs the same as the Define 7. There's no difference worthy of the name. We're talking mid 60s degrees Celsius. The ambience moved between 20 and 22 degrees in here, allowing for that. The two cases basically are the same. How do I know that? Because I built this PC into both cases to do a direct back-to-back comparison. Running Blender, this PC draws 220 watts at the wall socket. The graphics card is essentially idle. It's all CPU work, system work, memory work. The graphics card doesn't play any part in the equation. So my conclusion there is that the Define 7, that door that looks so closed off, doesn't impact cooling when you're talking around 200 watts of power draw. However, it's clear the front of the Define 7 had to have some restriction, and when I did time-spy stress test, oh brother, did I find it. Now we're talking about a wall power draw around the 400 watts mark. The graphics card runs at a very consistent temperature. In the Define 7 it was 66 degrees, whereas in the Meshify 2 it was 65 degrees, so nothing to write home about there. CPU temperature on the other hand, different story. In the Define 7 the max CPU temperature 59.5 degrees, in the Meshify 2 44.7 degrees. A huge change. It's clear the Define 7 can handle 200 or more watts of power. This case can handle at least 400 watts. It's breathing like a champ. It's easy to remove the door of the case, so I have the option of testing the Meshify 2 with the door open, pulling it off entirely, or removing the dust filter, which is one of the suggested configurations by Fractal, and just using the basic door frame. Removing the filter from the door helps the temperatures to the tune of about 1 degree. Removing the door in its entirety drops temperatures by about 3 degrees. For the sake of 1 degree, I'd use the Meshify 2 with the filter in place. I'm quite sure that by now you've got the impression that Leo likes the Meshify 2. Meshify 2 has almost no negatives against it. From my own selfish point of view, I prefer a white case with a white interior rather than black and white combo, because doing video and photos with all this light absorbent material, it's tricky. So that's my view. I'd like a white option, genuinely white, black. If you want the black and white combo, so be it, and also gunmetal grey is also fine. This doesn't work for me quite as well as it might. The front panel, you've got 2 USB Type A's and a Type C. Earlier versions had 4 USBs because you had USB 2, USB 3, and then you had a Type C, Type 3.1. So we've lost, in inverted commas, 2 Type A's. I can't complain about the front I/O. It's got plenty of ports. It's not really a problem. There was one screw that was in an awkward location when I moved the case from, converted the case rather, from open configuration to storage configuration. One screw. It's a tiny point. And also, as far as I can see, you have to remove the drive cage through, if you want to take the drive cage out of the bottom and pull it out, you have to take it out where the power supply goes, which seems a bit silly to me. In other words, you can do it when the case is fresh out of the box. Once you build a PC, that would be, a nightmare. So that might be an issue for some people. Tiny, tiny, tiny points. So my final review, this is certainly a must-have product, no doubt about that. I'm not yet certain in my mind if it's a 9 or 9.5. I'm leaning towards 9.5, but whatever the final mark, it's really good. I have barely mentioned pricing. The price of the Define 7 at the moment is still listed in some places at £150. You can find it discounted to £125. The Meshify 2 goes on sale at £129 in this version. There's also a non-glass version that's slightly cheaper, but let's ignore that. So £129, in other words, it's about £20 cheaper than Define 7 was, certainly £10. You have the one top panel rather than a choice. The hardware inside is basically Define 7, and then they've changed the front panel. To my mind, much for the better. But what I really like about this case is the way you can pull it apart. It's almost entirely tool-free. excellent design by Fractal Design. They're really getting into their stride these days. This is good. I cannot wait to see what they come up with next. If you like this video, give it the proverbial thumbs up. I'm sure you're already subscribed though, aren't you? Head over to kitguru.net to read our news and reviews.